Let's go ahead and get started. That's a secret, kind of like they have on the plays on the side, you know, the science forum signals. I'm signaling them. Only they know what that means. It's good to see everybody. We have a continuation tonight of our study of challenges to the Christian home. Last week we ran out of time. We were talking about the challenge of stolen arrows. So that's why I call tonight the challenge of stolen arrows part 2. We will try to get finished in just about the amount of time we have to finish up the material. Before we begin our discussion, Jack's going to lead us in prayer, so let us all bow. Yeah. We have been talking about stolen arrows. The title comes from Psalm 127:4, the blessing of children. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. And yet, those children are being stolen in many cases, stolen spiritually, stolen from Christian families, from Christian homes. And we're talking about that threat and what might be done about it. I showed you statistics. We won't go back over them, but what it amounts to is, Brother Flavel Yakeley's done a great deal of study on our young people after they leave congregations, and the results are not good. So many, way too many, even if these numbers are not exactly right, far too many are, once they leave the home, once they become independent, they also depart from the church. So we're talking about that again tonight. Last week we got through the first part. We talked about the powerful influence of the world. And remember, the key to all of this is understanding why we are losing them, understanding what's happening so that Christian families can do something about it. We talked about the inadequate impact of the home. We have to be proactive because Satan and all of his allies are certainly proactive. And we had gotten through much of this material last week, but not all of it. So we will continue to think about that. There's a very, very special command, a very, very specific command in Ephesians 6 and verse 4, addressed to fathers. Obviously, mothers are not without responsibility, but as leaders of the family, fathers certainly are. You fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. And just a few weeks ago, we talked about in a lesson on Sunday morning the words, training, and admonition. We've mentioned that a couple of times, so I won't go back over that. But we'll simply summarize it by saying that those two things involve a great deal of time and attention to the role that the father is given specifically in this case. Training and admonition involves both saying to the child, here's what you need to do to please God. If you do this, you will not be pleasing God. Or if you are doing this, to rebuke, to admonish, to say, okay, you've got to stop that. It's both of knowledge, it's encouragement, and it's when necessary, it is rebuking and even discipline. So that is the responsibility. We've noted already in our study this quarter a number of things that tend to take us away from our responsibilities in the home, not just in dealing with our children, but in general. And so This is no surprise to us. As we were approaching the holiday season, I've been seeing this particular phrase on Facebook a number of times, and probably we'll see it again as we get closer to the Christmas season. It simply says presence, P-R-E-S-C-E-N-C-E, as in you're present for something, rather than presents, P-R-E-S-E-N-T-S, as in those things you wrap up with paper and bow and hand to someone. Presence rather than presents. You know, we can give our child many things, but when it comes to their spiritual well-being, their spiritual growth, the presents have a very, very small role in that, whereas our physical presence with them has a tremendous role. And I'm going to put these verses up, although they're often noted and thought about. Well, I forgot about this one first here that I inserted. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Time is a commodity. Time is valuable, and we trade our time for something. We're either using it well and maybe getting a bargain with our time from what we're using it for, or we are wasting it. We're not getting anything in return. Our time is spent sort of like we call, they refer to calories. You know, there's calories that are of no value. They're wasted calories, and yet they mount up in our bodies. But as far as nutrition, they're nothing. Well, we can use our time for some things, but when we come to put a spiritual value on them, especially talking about our children, which is our application now, they're not any good at all. They're not helping us to be the parents that we need to be, or to help our young people to be what they need to be. So we're trading our time for something, and in terms of our children, we need to trade it carefully. Now here's the verses that I put in that we've talked about a great deal in the past, and many lessons have been preached and taught on this passage. The earlier part, of course, tell the Israelites to remember their God. The Shema is there, that statement that the faithful Jews would stop and repeat, 3 times a day. The Lord our God, the Lord, He is one. And then about keeping His words close to us. But then we proceed on, the next couple of verses here. We don't just keep these words inside of us, we pass these words on. And that is intended from generation to generation. Now, what I have it for tonight is to address this subject of time, because from what I read, from what I see, one of the problems that happens to the family, and why perhaps the family, the Christian home, isn't doing what needs to be done in all cases, is because the time is, so many demands are made upon the time. So I want us to think about here something about the timing that Moses mentions here in Deuteronomy. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. Remember, Deuteronomy was a second giving, a repeat of the law that Moses had already given them, but now it's a new generation about to go into the promised land, and nobody over 40 was going to be there except for Joshua and Caleb. So he's repeating the law. And these words, you shall teach them diligently to your children. Now notice the timing here. And shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Now if we'll think about that, many of us can see in our families the time for application of this with our children. When you sit in your house, we have time together for the activities that a family has. At least we should try to make those and be sure they happen. They'll be different with every family, and sometimes employment is a factor there. But we know that somewhere along the way we'll have time when we're sitting in the house, and we'll have time to carry out this duty that God has given us of training and admonishing them. A natural time. A time when we'll turn off the television, turn off all the electronic gadgets, turn off, don't be hooked up to the internet in some way, but simply be a family talking to each other. And I'm going to suggest share some statistics here in just a moment about how powerful that can actually be. But not only that, but when you walk by the way. Now back then it would literally be walking by the way probably. And I recall growing up, I had a father and a grandfather who both talked to me as we walked by the way, because we were out on the farm and it seemed like we were always repairing a fence where a cow got out. And we'd be repairing fences, and I am quite sure that I received a good bit of my parental and grandparental exhortations while we were doing that. And it's just a natural time. So if anyone is blessed with that kind of time with their children, can make that opportunity, then that's a normal time. If not, we can do it while we're in our cars. Instead of everybody in the car except Dad, hopefully, who's driving, having on earphones and looking at some kind of screen and totally separated from each other as far as communication. Instead, we can be talking in the car. We can talk about things that are important. That would seem to me to be our parallel to when you walk by the way, or when you drive down the road, when you go to grandma's house, or you go on some other lengthy or even a short time. Taking them to school, coming back from school, times like that. You may have to learn to phrase your questions correctly about, how was school, or you'll get okay every day when they get in the car. For some young people, I know that seems to be the way. But it's a time for talking, and a time to talk about not just the weather and the day's activities, but, sometimes the opportunity to work in a spiritual principle there in the course of conversation. When you lie down before going to bed at night, a great time to interact, parent and child. Most of us are aware of that. We tuck them in until they're too big and they say, I don't need to be tucked in anymore, and then we have to figure out some other nightly ritual. But still there's an opportunity there to speak with them, to share something that is very important, the words that God has given us that we're to pass on to them. Because even though this is an Old Testament setting, the principle is still there. God gave us a message. It's supposed to be in our heart, and it's supposed to be passed on to our children, whether it's the Israelites or whether it's us today or any other place or culture. And then finally, when you rise up in the morning is a good time. I read a suggestion someone said about giving your child a verse. So here's the verse of the day. I want you to repeat that several times today, and I want you to memorize that. Let's talk about it when you get home tonight. A memory verse for the day. A good way to start the day. Or even a memory verse just with the principle. Think about this principle as you go through the day. We try to do that at Rolling Hills Bible Camp every morning. When we come up and we have flagpole and everybody gathers around, we talk about a verse that's somehow related to our theme. And then we try to highlight that verse at different times throughout the day. So no reason a family couldn't start out that way as well, as long as their work demands, I suppose, doesn't keep them from that. But the point is, use the time that we have, be aware of that time, focus on that time, so that it is redeemed in a good way, so it's productive. Now, I want to share with you some statistics here. And remember, statistics, are in some ways generalized statements. Be when we see some statistics, we say, well, there's a good bit of sense in that. I can understand, and that's something I ought to be aware of and perhaps take action on. This particular study has to do with, the article was called The Importance of Family Dinners, and it was based upon a study that was done by Columbia University. Okay, the number of teens, and this is kind of wordy here, but I'll repeat it if I have to. The number of teens that have regular family dinners drops by 50% as their substance abuse risk increases sevenfold, according to a survey here by teenagers by Columbia University. So there's a relationship between the things that a child chooses to get involved in as he or she gets the freedom versus family dinners. And it gets more specific than that. The more often children have dinner with their parents, the less likely they are to smoke, drink, or use illegal drugs. And then some statistics here. Compared to teens who have family dinners twice a week or less, that's one group, twice a week or less. Teens who have dinner with their families 5 or more times a week, that's the other group, two groups here. The group that only has it 2 or less, 32%, the group that has it 5 times or more, 32% more likely to have never tried cigarettes, 45% more likely to have never tried alcohol, 24% more likely to have never smoked marijuana. Now, is there something magical about a family dinner together? They've been around for a long time, haven't they? And there's nothing magic about a family dinner together. And the kind of correlation that we're seeing here makes us think about what is it that goes on at a family dinner that would result in that kind of drastic statistics. Well, of course, if we think about it a little bit, I think we can figure out that a lot of good things go on at a family dinner when the family is together, when family and children eat together. And the fact that they are doing that probably suggests some other lines of communication, some other times being together, redeeming the time in which mom and dad are involved in the children's life. And the children are talking to mom and dad about things that they need to talk to them about, rather than being with their peers somewhere where everybody's at the same level of ignorance about a lot of decisions, right? So that's not the magic of family dinners together. That is the spiritual opportunity of family dinners together. And I found those statistics rather remarkable. Let's see if I've got any more in that category. Okay, now we've already talked about when you rise up and lie down and walk by the way. The point being, that's one of those times when you sit in your house. That is an automatic opportunity. And someone says, well, we're just so busy, we don't do that anymore. Well, it's surely a family tradition that we would do well to nurture from the early years all the way up. I just have that as an understanding. You can see why a teenager, you suddenly say, okay, we're going to start having family dinners together. Every night at 6:30 we're going to eat at this table, and you've got to be here. When it hasn't been done, in the past. You can imagine what a teenager is going to think. What? I can't grab something and swallow it whole and run over to my friend's house. But if it's been cultivated, if it's been nurtured from the earliest years, and it is a time not when children are raked over the coals, not when they're corrected. It's not a bright light in your face questioning situation. It's a time of discussing things that are important, and then talking about why they're important. here's this situation that happened at school. How did you handle it? Why did you handle it that way? Whether it's good or bad, why did you handle it that way? And just a time for communication. And these statistics, I think, would support any decision to go with something like that because of what tends to happen when that is done. It takes time to do a number of things as far as parenting is concerned. I still haven't got a watch battery, so I'm going to have to put my phone up here. It takes time to understand them. Isn't that one of the things that just consistently comes up between parents, and especially by the time they get to be teenagers? One or the other or both is saying, you don't understand me, or I don't understand you. It takes time to understand back and forth, and it takes time to build that understanding. It takes time to communicate with them. It can't be done very effectively with email and text messages or tweeting. It takes time to teach them because the principles take longer to discuss than simply what was your decision? What are we going to do in this, but why are we going to do that? What part of God's will would lead us to decide to do that or not do that? It takes time to correct them because that has to be done with a right attitude. It takes time to illustrate behavior for them. How are young men and young women, boys and girls, going to learn how a mother and a father, a husband and a wife interact and live in a way that they're teaching them unless they're around to see them, or unless the parents are around to see for the kids to see them? It takes time to illustrate the right behavior, as Christian parents will want to do. It takes time to help them make applications when either something good or something bad. We mentioned this, I think, when we talked about television. Something on television may be good to point out and talk about the principle, or it may be bad and it's still good to point out and talk about the principle. Like why would we want to do this? Why would we not want to do this? So it takes time for all of these things, and it's very easy for Satan to jerk that time away from us, to make us less the communicating family than we would really want to be. I had, here it is, an article. This comes from Focus Press. I've mentioned this before, Think magazine. It's published by a group called Focus Press. I've recommended it before. I recommend it again. We've sent out some free articles before that they've given us to distribute at no charge for people to look at. Tremendous publication that deals with things that are going on today, the things that families and children and adults, Christians in general, are actually dealing with. This comes from an article in one of their issues, and it's called 6 Things Christian Young People Need to Know Before Leaving Home. We think about these 6 things, and we're reminded of a responsibility as parents. Number 1, the writer there from Focus Press suggests they should know why they believe and behave the way they do. Because they're getting ready to go out into a situation where they're going to be making the choices. And in a lot of cases, their mindset is, Mom and Dad are not going to know about this. They're not going to have any input on this. So they need to know before they leave the home, before sometimes they leave their home congregation. They need to know what it is that causes them to believe what their values are, why they believe that, and why that causes them to live a certain way. Because the statistics that Brother Yakeley had point out, many times that does not happen. And the article goes ahead to suggest that, that doesn't need to be because I told you, or because it's the way our family's always done this, or because you're living under my roof. All of those are ineffective ways of answering the question for a young person who's going to reach independence. Here's what you believe. Here's why you believe what you do and why you behave like you do. Those are inadequate, and in fact, those are negative responses. So they need to know why they believe what they do and why they behave the way they do. Secondly, they need to know how to defend the existence of God, the creation account, and biblical inerrancy. Okay, somebody with the Barna Group, and we've talked about George Barna a number of times in the past. He is the premier statistic gatherer or study of religious groups. And this is from an overall religious group study. This is not about Churches of Christ. But they studied kids 13 to 17 and who were planning to go into an advanced education, in other words, college, university somewhere. And they found out that 52% of these church-going 13 to 17-year-olds wanted to go into a science-related career. And yet, only 1% said that back in the whatever religious group they were part of, had they ever received training, specific discussions about how to defend the existence of God, the creation account, and biblical inerrancy. So it would be no wonder that people aren't prepared, the people who aren't prepared turn away. Because we know what's going to happen out there in the world of science, don't we? There are a few wonderful, God-fearing, Bible-believing science teachers, professors out there in our country. But they're in the minority. And depending on where our young person goes to school, unless it's a Christian college, they're going to be challenged to defend the existence of God, the creation account, and the inerrancy of Scripture. The fundamental things of why we believe what we do and why we behave the way we do, right? So that is something that young people need to know before they leave home. The third thing it's listed, young people need to know how to connect with their church family. And that means that they aren't a separate group, but they are a integrated part of the church, and they're active in things. And I think of things that we do here. Our young men, as soon as they're able to, we have them being involved in our services here. Our young ladies learning how to teach a Bible class, teach to teach, and things like that. They need to be incorporated and see how that they are part of the church. It's not the church, and then there's youth. The youth are a big part of the church. And that is his point in this particular aspect here. Number 4, they need to know how to study for themselves. Not in the library writing a term paper on, chemistry or biology or something like that. They need to learn how to study the Bible, because no matter how much we might prepare a young person, they're going to run into questions they've not faced, aren't they? When they meet that atheistic professor or that classmate that asks them, why in the world do you go to church every Sunday? That's ridiculous. Or why in the world don't you have a piano? They need to be able to study for themselves God's Word, and obviously to have their own faith. How to teach others. They don't have to have material memorized, but they need to be able to figure out some way to teach others, to know enough to say, okay, not done this before. Hopefully they have, but I've not done this before. But we can get started on this, and then maybe I can call Dad or call a Bible class teacher, something like that, and get some more ideas about it. But they need to be prepared to share the gospel with others. Not as a preacher, not even as a Bible class teacher necessarily. Everybody's not ready for that. but to share their faith with somebody, to do what Peter said. Whoever asks a question for a reason for the hope that's within you, to be able to answer them in meekness and fear. And then number 6, their role and sense of purpose in church work. And again, all of them will not be elders, preachers, deacons, even Bible class teachers, but to know that there is a place that the body, just like Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12, every member is a part of the body. And so they need to figure out where they fit in, what they can do. And then, of course, they're likely to grow. Many times that will happen as they have more experience. So those are 6 things that our young people need to know before they leave home. Okay, we've got one more section that's not too long necessarily. Let me stop and see if anybody has input here. Yes, ma'am. Good point. For those who couldn't hear that, the gist of it is quality time takes place within the atmosphere of quantity time. You see, we can't have our young person who's exactly ready at a particular moment and say, okay, now we're going to talk about this subject. I need to know what's on your heart and mind. We got 5 minutes to do that. Let's get this talked about. You can't do that with most young people, okay? It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work very well for us as adults, does it? We want to think about it. And our young people may not be ready to talk about what it is we're ready to talk about, but within the quantity of time, within the activities, there's a time to reflect and a time to begin a conversation about something. A time to take something that is a natural event of the day, of the events around them or whatever, and then deal with that in a positive way. Good point. Bart? Okay, I couldn't possibly repeat all that adequately, but the gist is, if you were not able to hear over on this side, sacrifice is involved. There's only time for so much in a parent's life and in a child's life. And Bart points out that children can get involved in so many things that are not bad, but they're not spiritual. They will result in no spiritual maturity for them. And maybe something parents won't develop too, want them to be involved in. And we all know how schools, extracurricular activities how time can be filled up for us if we do not. So we may have to make sacrifices. We've got to teach our children to sacrifice anyway, don't we? Right? They're never going to be able to act like the world. And, you know, that for a while that may feel like a sacrifice. At some point, they might grow enough that, I don't miss that at all. I can't believe I even wanted to do that once upon a time. But at first, it's a sacrifice. They've got to learn that we sacrifice. If we're going to have the time to do these other things that are important, that's going to demand sacrifice. So Bart said that in a much more firm way there and organized way, but that's kind of the gist of it. John? Mm-hmm. John's reemphasizing the need for preparation because they are barraged with evolution, atheism, and so forth once they leave the home in most environments they go to. Okay, John, and then I saw a hand back here somewhere. Okay, John? Mm-hmm.
That's why a lot of when they do leave the home, they kind of feel like with a hate toward the church, and sometimes for their parents, they feel like they have really been stunted and cheated, and that's what I find in working with members of families of the church, that most of those children have problems with, and what we call sacrifices dead is that children see that they themselves are the sacrifice.
Okay.
I think that's something we need to kind of work with a little bit more, perhaps. That would bring a little more harmony within families.
Okay. John brings up the question about finding a balance here in deciding how the sacrifice is going to work, and also experience with young people who feel that they've been the sacrifice, and that rather than sacrificing for the Lord, it's been, I guess, mistreatment of them in the way they've been limited, something like that. So we obviously don't have time to deal with that very long right now. So that's something we need to think ahead of time. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Good point there. The point is that we need to show them in the Bible and where in the Bible it comes from. So this is not our culture. This is not your parents. This is God's Word and where it comes from. Good point. Okay, we did not get finished, but that's okay. We had good discussion. So we may finish this up next week, and we may spend the whole time on it. Thank you.